Thanks again for joining us. We're really excited about today's session. I am going to hand things off to Professor Lynn Garrioch, who's going to go first, and I'm going to darken my screen and get out of your way. So Lynn, take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So I'm going to do part one, and what I wanted to focus on today is thinking about the inequality or injustice that happens throughout our legal system. And I actually wanted to give 3 separate examples of that disparity or inequality that happens throughout the legal system. But to start with, I need to talk about 3 terms. And the first 2 terms have to do with research and then applying research findings to the real world. And so Gary Wells in 1978 was studying eyewitness testimony and identified estimator variables versus system variables. And the distinction is really important, in part because we can study things in the lab like manipulate who's the perpetrator and what the perpetrator looks like, and who's the victim and what the victim looks like. And we can study those outcomes. But in the real world, we're not able to decide what the race of the perpetrator is, what the race of the witness is. And so those are estimator variables. System variables, on the other hand, are variables that we can study in the lab, and then we can control them in real life. And so these are variables that are under the control of the police and other members of the criminal justice system. So as I go through the 3 examples, I want you to keep this in the back of your mind of things we can't control and things we can control. The third term that I want you to think about throughout the 3 examples is this term called implicit bias. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of implicit bias, but I just want to remind you of what this term means. Often we hold attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, our decisions in an unconscious manner. So I'm going to give you a concrete example. We think we don't have issues with people of a different race, right? And yet, in the middle of the night, we're walking home after being out maybe at a nightclub, and we see a group of people, and we automatically have a reaction to that group of people, maybe because they are Black, or maybe because they are Latinx. And we don't think of ourselves as racist, but we suddenly are clutching our purse or walking in a different direction, fearful of these people automatically. It's implicit bias, and it actually plays out in the legal system over and over again. So let me go through 3 examples. And what I thought I would do with each of these examples is first show you a real life case, and then talk about it on the other side. So I said I would start with the shooting of people by the shooting of people by police officers. And in this current example, it's a man who is shot by a police officer, and it's disturbing because it's disturbing to see somebody shot, obviously. But it is so over the top ridiculous that you might laugh a little bit because it's a little bit ridiculous. The other thing that I wanted to just say ahead of time before playing the video is that there is swearing, and I'm not really apologizing for the swearing. I'm just giving a bit of a trigger warning about the swearing, but I think the swearing is a little bit appropriate. So let's watch the video, and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
South Carolina State Trooper Sean Gruber has been fired after video has been released of his interaction during a routine traffic stop. Now, he pulled over a man by the name of LeVar Edward Jones. Apparently, he wasn't wearing his seatbelt.
Oh, here's how it all played out.
Have your license, please. Get out of the car! Get out of the Get on the ground! Get on the ground! Put your hands behind your back. 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 Put your hands behind your back.
What did I do, sir?
Are you hit?
I think so. I can't feel my leg. I don't know what happened. I just grabbed my leg.
Brakes on 866. I need a 1052.
Why did you shoot me?
Well, you dove head first back into your car.
I'm sorry.
Then you jumped back out. I'm telling you, get out of your car.
I'm sorry. I didn't hear 2 words, sir.
What a fucked up world. He's saying I'm sorry to the cop
who just shot
He's
him.
apologizing to an incompetent police officer who just shot him. I'm not a cop. I don't have any friends I have some friends who are cops, but they're not close. But I've watched a lot of cop television shows, and you have him step away from the car. You ask him, he abandoned all police procedure, all training, this incompetent fuck.
Okay.
And then when the guy just on instinct, like a cop says, get your license, it's like, oh, well, my wallet's right here, I'll go get it. And so he shot him.
Because he's not a criminal, he's just a person responding to the police. Look how polite he was after he was shot.
First of all, I've been pulled over for not wearing my seatbelt. The cop did not have me step out of my vehicle, okay? Why was he told to step out of his vehicle in the first place? I don't really understand that. And when his reaction to you asking him to show his license is to reach to get his license, you don't shoot. Like
Dove head first.
He didn't dive head first into the car. Is that? I mean, you're looking at the video. You don't need me to explain it for you. He was shot once in the hip, but you did hear 3 shots fired. And you're right, Ben. I think the most
He kept shooting after his hands were up.
He kept shooting at the door. That's great.
This guy is amazing.
Yeah.
Now, he has been fired, okay? The cop has been fired, so there's a little bit of justice there, but he is facing criminal charges as well. He was charged with assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature, a felony which carries a penalty of up to 20 years behind bars. South Carolina.
Okay, so we've all watched the news and heard about police shootings. So psychologists have studied this in the lab, and I'm going to talk about a classic study that was conducted in 2002, but there are many studies that confirm the findings. In this particular study, the researchers actually tested police officers and college students, and lo and behold, the trained police officers had the same rates as the college students, so did as well or as poorly as the college students. They also administered a mean world survey, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But let me just tell you the main findings. The main findings were that people were faster to shoot a Black person than a white person, so their response time was faster. They were more likely to shoot a Black person than a white person on this video game. And they made more errors between trying to figure out whether the person had a gun or not when it was Black versus white. Again, the police officers who were supposed to be trained did as well or as poorly as the college students. And so I think about the estimator variables and then the system variables. In this case, the estimator variables are the race of the target and whether there is a presence of a gun, and I apologize for the typo, correct that. But also, the system variable would be training. What can we do to help police officers who might have an implicit bias that this Black man is dangerous, this Black man who turned into his truck is getting a gun versus getting a wallet, right? What could we do with training to help police officers react slower, get the frontal lobe working, and thinking about things a little more systematically? In the example that I just gave you, that police officer asked him for his wallet. The man complies, and then he gets shot. So that's my first example. My second example is going to be mistaken eyewitness identification.
It was July of 1984. I was a student at Elon College. As I was sleeping, a man jumped up on my bed, and I knew that he was going to rape me, and I felt pretty confident he was going to kill me.
One day they come and get me and take me to the Burleson Police Department for a physical lineup, and they put those charges on me. I'm sitting in my cell thinking, what did I do to deserve something like this?
I was just overwhelmed with relief. I mean, this man was going to be taken off the streets, and he would never, ever hurt another woman again.
I knew that I was in prison. I knew I wasn't supposed to be, but there's a reason for everything. I was on my way to the gym, and I happened to notice an inmate. I said, you kind of look like the drawing of part of the sketch of a crime that they convicted me on. Did you commit the crime?
Ronald Cotton believed the actual perpetrator was a man by the name of Bobby Poole, who was in the same prison.
And I found out that he confessed to another inmate that was serving his time. I wrote to the Court of Appeals in Raleigh and requested a DNA test. I said, I'm an innocent man. The good Lord knows it up above. And I want to have this test done.
Captain Galden and the assistant district attorney paid me a visit. They said the DNA test is back and it belongs to Bobby Poole.
The warden told me, he said, Cotton, he said, you're going home in the morning. You're an innocent man.
I asked for a private meeting between Ronald and myself, and I just looked at him and I said, if I spent every second of every minute of every hour of every day for the rest of my life telling you I'm sorry, can you ever forgive me? And he started to cry, and I had been sobbing, and he took my hand and he said, I forgave you years ago.
Okay, so Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton speak around the United States and talk about their experience. I'm going to give you a few more details because I wanted to keep the clip short. Jennifer Cotton identifies Ronald Cotton, but the night of her rape, another woman was raped at the same time, and the police assume it was the same perpetrator. And sorry, I shouldn't have said at the same time, but on the same night. And the police assume it's the same perpetrator. The other woman is unable to identify Ronald Cotton, so they ignore that and they go with Jennifer Thompson's identification of Ronald Cotton. What we know from research is that whites have difficulty identifying blacks in a lineup, and blacks have difficulty identifying whites in a lineup. And so there are more errors with cross-race identification, which we have identified as cross-race misidentification. Now, again, we can't change who the perpetrator is and the race of the perpetrator, and we can't change the race of the victim. But what we do know is that the race of the victim and the race of the perpetrator do matter on whether somebody is going to make a mistake or not. There are things we can control within the system, though. And so I have two terms down here of confirmation bias, which I'm going to suggest that the police had confirmation bias. They put together a lineup. They suspected it was Ronald Cotton. And when the first woman did not identify Ronald Cotton, they didn't consider her a good witness. When Jennifer Thompson identifies Ronald Cotton, they go, yes, she's a good witness, right? And just accept that she must be accurate. However, if you watch a whole documentary on this, and it is on YouTube if you want to watch a whole documentary on this particular issue, it turns out that Jennifer Thompson was not initially confident in who she chose, and she was picking between two people. And the police sort of egg her on to actually pick Ronald Cotton. And they sort of unconsciously and consciously said, it's this other guy. And in fact, it's person, I think number 5. I can't actually see the screen, but I think it's person number 5. When she picks person number 5, they tell her, you got the man, you've done it. This builds her confidence. Then she goes into court and says, I am 100% confident that this is the man who raped me, despite the fact that she wasn't initially confident, but her confidence has been built up. Further, the jury sees a confident witness and so assumes the confident witness must be accurate. We know this from lots of research that jurors who see a confident witness assume a confident witness is accurate. The reality is there is no correlation between confidence and accuracy. And so they're using a marker in an ineffective way and being misled by her confidence. I'm going to go one more, and this is a case coming out of Florida. Florida was reviewing their sentencing requirements and discovered that Black convicts received longer sentences than whites.
On the bench, an in-depth analysis shows Blacks are being given longer prison sentences than whites in Florida, even if they commit the same crime.
In any way, do you think this is racial?
Absolutely. It is racist. It is. It is.
The Florida sentencing system is broken and biased. That's the finding of a study looking at a decade of convictions and sentences.
NBC2 investigator David Hodges has been poring over the results for Southwest Florida, where the problem was also found.
Like most areas across the state, the records compiled by the Sarasota Herald Tribune show Black defendants here tend to get longer prison sentences than whites. Tonight, there are many calling for reform.
Be seated. Sit down.
A Collier County court audience is told to take a seat, but Kyrique Seymour has supporters standing with him.
I am heartbroken.
Alana Roden is Seymour's grandmother.
We're here for him unconditionally, and we're going down with him.
With her is Collier County NAACP President Vincent Keys. He's not there protesting Seymour's innocence, but ensuring he is treated fairly in the courtroom.
Do you think there's an issue with racial bias in the judicial system?
Well, I honestly believe that there's a big bias.
All of us have perhaps a level of implicit bias, and certainly the judges are not immune to that.
Emily Lacaze is an investigations editor at the Sarasota Herald Tribune. With her colleagues, she analyzed criminal convictions across Florida from 2004 to 2015.
There were 82 million records.
They found Blacks were often receiving longer sentences than whites for the same crime.
We saw that felony drug crimes were often the cause of the greatest disparities.
And the same criminal history.
You would expect that defendants with the same scores would generally receive about the same sentences, but that is absolutely not what we found.
In Lee County, they found Blacks are sentenced to an average of 1,586 days in prison when convicted of robbery. Whites are sentenced to 1,090 days. Lacaze says their records show whites are more likely to get leniency from judges, a majority of whom are also white.
Okay, so just really quickly to wrap up with this last example, we know that there are sentence disparities with race of the perpetrator and race of the victim. If you are a Black perpetrator with a white victim, then you are going to receive a longer sentence than a Black perpetrator with a Black victim. And we also know that Blacks receive longer sentences than whites. Some of this is built into the legal system. I'll give you a concrete example that has been changed, thank goodness. But a concrete example was, for the longest time, crack cocaine. People who had possession with crack cocaine received longer sentences than people with cocaine, despite the fact that it's basically the same drug, just in a different format. This has now been changed, but judges have discretion and they rely on aggravating circumstances and mitigating circumstances. Aggravating circumstances are why you should be harsher with somebody, and mitigating is why you should be more lenient. And systematically, judges talk about aggravating circumstances with Black perpetrators more so than whites, and they talk about mitigating circumstances with whites more so than Blacks. I know I went through this really quickly and just gave you 3 examples, but there are tons of research on this topic that shows the disparity and injustice throughout the legal system. And if you would like to read a little more on this topic, Picking Cotton is a wonderful book, and it is written by Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton. And then another great book is Surviving Justice, America's Wrongfully Convicted and Exonerated. And here's some references. We'll figure out a way to post this somewhere so that you can follow up on these sources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. That was great. And Lynn, I'll just tell you all that Lynn was concerned about timing before, and you did that in just about exactly 20 minutes. So that was perfect. That was great. So I will now get out of the way again and hand it off to Kate Turcotte. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. And thanks to Advancement. And thank you to my friend and colleague, Lynn Garrioch, for sharing time with me today. And I'm going to share my screen as well. This may be a little wonky for me here. All right, here we go. So the title of my talk is sort of a subtitle that I gave to viewing the legal system through a liberal art education lens, and that is Cops Meet Comped, and I will explain what that means in just a few moments. And my talk today serves, I think, as a great next step in conceiving of policing and the legal system in America from where Lynn left off. So I hope that it feels continuous and like it makes logical sense. I think it does. So I am also going to be showing a video right off the bat, and this is going to be consisting only of data, so it should not invoke any upset in anyone, which is further evidence of what Dr. Garrioch explained in her presentation, which is that the criminal justice system, from policing to prosecution to corrections, is a heavily racialized one, disadvantaging people of color, and more specifically, Black men in this country. It was created by Vox News, not to be confused with that other Ox news channel, in response to the murder of Michael Brown in 2014 by a Ferguson, Missouri police officer. So you'll see reference to Ferguson, Missouri at the conclusion of this video. Or we'll see an ad. So we operate within this extraordinary racialization within our criminal justice system. And I would like for us to stay within this state as we talk today. Whoops, hold on. There we go. So I'm going to talk about a fellow by the name of Colonel K.L. Williams, who has trained thousands of officers, written books, and given many talks on culture within law enforcement agencies in this country, large and small. He's an advocate for education as a tool to mitigate the effects of racism within police departments and in society more broadly. And he is known for stating that on any given day in any police department in the nation, 15% of officers will do the right thing no matter what is happening. 15% of officers will abuse their authority at every opportunity. The remaining 70% could go either way, depending on who they are working with. Now, those 15% that are entrenched on either end of the extreme of the spectrum, according to Williams, we can't really do anything about them other than make sure they don't stay long on police departments on the one extreme, or that we want to keep them on the other extreme because those officers are the ones we want in our communities. What is it, though, about the huge swath of officers in the middle, that's 70%? Why are they so likely to go either way, according to Williams? Well, as a sociologist, I offer my own explanation. I teach a lot about socialization and acculturation, and this is what is happening, I argue, when officers are hired and trained by state and local municipalities. They're immediately placed into a setting which begins acclimatizing, I can never say that word, them to the way policing is and the way it should be. And this policing subculture is nested within both a larger culture and a society which is characterized by institutional racism. And that's racism that is built into the very structures of society, such as our educational system, our healthcare system, and the law enforcement and judicial systems. The results of institutionalized racism as they occur in the criminal justice system, as we saw in the video that I just played a few minutes ago. Because institutional racism is structural, it affects all police officers. In fact, it affects all of us, and we affect it. And so due to the entrenched nature of institutional racism, therefore, change is larger than individual officers, right? Dismantling it means flipping over of a table, as I tell my students in class, and certainly requires broad policy change, which necessitates political shift, which is a great deal more than individual officers can enact themselves, right? But wait a minute. We are society, and individual officers are the very people who make up the structure that we agree warrants cultural change. This is where we can focus, and this is where educating individual future law enforcement officers in mindful ways can create change. It sounds like a duh kind of point, as I also tell my students, but there is a reciprocal relationship between the individual officers and the police subculture or institutional culture within which they reside, and they inform and shape one another all the time. So aspects of an agency such as departmental policies have to begin, of course, with a single idea, an individual who finds a particular proposed policy to be important enough to think about, bring forward, act upon. Policies that are adopted help establish new norms of all type, and those norms are reinforced by leadership and by individual officers over the course of time. New officers to a department or agency then enter into the existing subculture under a particular set of norms, some broad, some unique to each agency. And those have shifted over time, and those officers respond to the ways of policing established under these norms. So norms are created, we make them up, and then we do a marvelous job of living within them. But what this also means is that each of us has the tools to shape and reshape norms through our individual actions, which are guided by our and societal values and beliefs. For police departments, it's no different. We can dismantle institutional racism in law enforcement. I and others argue that the best way to accomplish this is to educate officers with this dismantling in mind. And I present here that a very effective way to do this is not just through education, but an education rooted in the liberal arts. When cops are familiar with COMPT, officers are guided toward the value of evidence and the use of reason, and are provided with tools to use evidence to examine conditions such as institutional racism. And as an aside, Comte referred to sociology as the queen of the sciences. And if any of my theory students are on right now, they know that this is an answer to their midterm exam that they took yesterday. So currently, the vast majority of police departments throughout the country use a high school diploma as a minimum requirement for employment. Others require or prefer college credits or military experience, with very few agencies, mostly larger ones and disproportionately located in the northeastern United States, requiring a 4-year degree for employment. Research has varied on outcomes when officers have 4-year degrees, but most research indicates that a bachelor's degree helps to train officers to behave differently on the job than those without 4-year degrees. And I'm going to provide some evidence here speaking to that. For example, Officers with four-year college degrees are 40% less likely to use force, with force being defined by the researchers who did this project as anything from verbal threats to use force to the use of force itself. Officers with bachelor's degrees are close to 30% less likely to fire their weapon while on duty. In addition, officers who have shot their weapon once are more than 50% more likely than other officers to fire their weapon on subsequent occasions, therefore making college education a protective factor. Finally, officers with more years of education have fewer complaints made against them by members of their community and are less likely to be terminated for reasons associated with officer misconduct. Quite simply, education and liberal arts education provide the opportunity for students, these are future professionals in policing and other fields, to obtain important skills such as these. Even more importantly, given racialized policies within the criminal justice system, police brutality, and more specifically the murder of Blacks by law enforcement, these additional skills I list are needed in law enforcement more now than ever before. Officers who respond to a domestic disturbance call, for example, and use cultural relativism. That is, they take stock of the ways in which someone's culture can be different from their own and understand how this can present itself in ways that could belie an actual condition, such as danger, hostility, or threat, are dismantling piece by piece their toxic police culture where it exists. This is incredibly difficult for officers to do in the speck of a moment that they often have to operate within. But building that mental muscle memory through education is effective, and it is demonstrated through those statistics I just presented a moment ago. Does this mean that an education in the liberal arts will prevent racism, bigotry, violence, and aggression among police officers? Of course not. But the liberal education outcomes here at Colby-Sawyer, for example, which I have on the screen now, provide a good foundation for students majoring in crime and legal studies to think critically and use skills such as cultural relativism when they are in the field and elsewhere. It works effectively to frame conditions such as institutional racism for future officers who will very likely be sitting in that 70% of individuals discussed by Colonel Williams who could go either way in any particular situation. More specifically, the Crime and Legal Studies program here is nested firmly within the liberal arts, trains students broadly, and was created by faculty, including Professor Garrioch and myself, to emphasize ethics, social justice, and existing social, cultural, economic, and historical factors affecting those working within, and most importantly, those affected by the criminal justice system. This doesn't mean simply rooting out those who are the most deviant in society and throwing them into a prison system from which they will very likely not escape, given, and this is fact, we have a recidivism rate of over 50% in this country. Instead, this means working, albeit slowly, to dismantle conditions such as institutional racism through careers such as the ones folks will have interacting with family members of individuals who are incarcerated to prevent things like intergenerational incarceration, where a child of an incarcerated individual is currently at greatly increased risk for being incarcerated themselves. It is also rising through the ranks of a police department to become chief, and implementing hiring and other policies that encourage and reward diversity, education, critical thought, and ethical decision-making. In the nearer term, for current Colby-Sawyer students, this includes experiences such as internships for those planning on a career in law enforcement. In the literature, internships have been shown to markedly increase ethical decision-making skills and sharpen qualities in officers such as empathy and cultural awareness. So where do I advocate things head from here? Four-year degrees have been found to enhance the technical training that officers receive, not to replace it. So there is a need for both. Existing training programs should remain. However, there should be an increased awareness of the value of a liberal arts education. In 2015, President Trump issued an executive order calling for increased training and credentialing to reduce the use of excessive force by police, but the order did not mention the need for police to get a college education. I argue that our new administration, when it assumes office, should present an order that includes specific federal educational incentives for police officers, especially for degrees having a liberal arts foundation. Institutionally and culturally, there should be a shift toward community and problem-oriented policing, whereby community conditions that are acting to oppress certain groups of individuals are identified and addressed so as to promote diversity and diverse thought, agency among all residents, and a sense of safety and community. Finally, thoughtful leaders should be encouraged and rewarded. This acts to both promote individuals who will serve in the best interests of their communities, but also marginalizes poor behavior, those 15% of officers who should not be working in the field. So we should emphasize what is good and root out what is not. And so I thank you all very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you, Lynn. Really great. We've had a bunch of questions come in that I'm going to try to sort through and pass on to you. Lots and lots to think about there, and lots of information. Kate, because you just finished, you really kind of finished up in response to one of the questions, and I think you kind of captured it, but one of the questions that came in early in your talk as you were talking about what was happening was what kind of reform you would push for to mitigate rampant racism embedded. And it was right after your slide on 15% will do the right thing, 15% will not, and 70% are in play. I think you summed it up with increased education. Is there a move for that beyond what President Trump has issued? Is there a legislative group out there advocating for what you said, and is there reform beyond the additional educational requirements that you've outlined?
Well, to be honest, you know, as familiar as I may be about it, I'm also unfamiliar with what's going on, of course, in individual states and municipalities and things like that. I'm not aware of a kind of broad, you know, push other than that which was put forth by the Trump administration and which I talked about. From what I have read and what I understand, it is very, very piecemeal and depends a great deal upon the culture within an individual department or agency or city. And there is research that indicates that a leader who, in the form of a chief or other supervising authority figure within a department, the more education they have, the more likely they are to hire officers with more years of college education, for example, and the more likely they are to value that as a part, an integral part of the training of those officers. I hope that answers the question somewhat.
I'm gonna follow. Oh, go ahead.
Can I just add to that really quickly? My understanding from the research also is jurisdictions, the larger jurisdictions are more likely to have a higher standard and have more of an expectation that you have at least some college or college. And smaller jurisdictions are less likely to have that.
So that was one of the follow-ups, was basically, it parallels that. It wasn't quite this, but the question was, is this more of a problem in urban areas as opposed to rural? But it may in fact be the flip because of money and just hiring rates, right? If you can't pay somebody a living wage and you don't have a lot of infrastructure and you're in a small community, you may set that bar lower. Does that sound somewhat logical as a next step?
I do, and the perceived demands of officers within a large jurisdiction or city are much different than those of a smaller community, a smaller town. And I do say perceived because law enforcement in cities and towns of all size have a whole lot of burden placed upon them. It may be a different kind of burden, but I think the perceived burden placed upon officers in larger cities, such as New York, Chicago, things like that, are greater, and there's this culture of needing a degree or years of college, whereas smaller communities aren't perceived in the same way.
Yeah. Lynn, one of your colleagues asked, is the field of forensic psychology trained to identify issues of systemic racism in the legal system? Is this one of the goals of the field? Is that sort of a grounding foundation of forensic psychology?
I wish it were. So, yeah, I wish it were. No. The reality is forensic psychology is a narrow area within psychology and the law. And so you're more likely, if you are in the broader area of psychology and the law, to deal with some of these issues in your educational background. Forensic psychology tends to think of the world as white upper middle class. And a lot of the research is done on white upper middle class participants, and often generalized to white middle class participants. So unfortunately, forensic psychology has a lot of work to do. I think the broader area of psychology in the law is finally, for the first, in the last 20 years, really sort of thinking about race in the legal system. But it's recent. I will say it's a very recent change in psychology and the law.
I think we covered this a little bit, but it's back to the relation of training and education. And it's a really good question. Kate, I don't know if there's an answer to it. I'm going to read it verbatim because it just gets right to it. How did we get to the point where one of the most important roles in society requires only a high school diploma, compared to lawyers, judges, and other positions in the legal justice system requiring additional degrees? You have a helpful answer that can make us feel better about that?
I know. I mean, it's a part of the devaluing of certain professions. It's not a feminized profession, but it kind of works in tandem in the same way that certain professions have been feminized and in that devalued. Yeah, I don't know, Lynn, if you have anything insightful to say. The only thing I have is absolutely. And you could make the same argument, and I do all the time, about teachers, right? Why are there professions that are seemingly on the margins of society in terms of how they're rewarded and what is required of them when they are so vitally important to us all?
Yeah. And I don't have an answer other than I think police officers are underpaid. And when they're underpaid, then I think the qualifications to become a police officer might be a little bit lower. But I don't have a good answer.
Oh, I think you're muted now, Dan.
Sorry about that. I'm going to call him out by name, but Cameron Post says, as a teacher, thank you very much for highlighting that and pointing that out. And for all of us who work in education, yes, we agree, Cameron. Let me open this back up so I can get back to what I was looking at here. This was directed to Kate, but I think it may apply to both of you. Are there activities that you use in your classes to help students question? This came in right as you were talking about institutional norms. Are there activities that you use in your classes to help students question institutional norms, and what would that look like? And Lynn, I'd say the same thing just about this, the sort of embedded and implicit bias that we see in professions. Is there a way to sort of open people's training, their own training, for keeping an eye out for that? And I'll start with you, Kate.
Golly, making me come up with activities I use in class on the fly. Well, it really, no. It's a fabulous question. And I think it starts actually in Introduction to Sociology, which I'm teaching right now. And we just finished covering deviance and crime in class. And I think step one in thinking about all of this, thinking about the institutionalization that what we have built, is to think about the fact, as I said, that we created it. And so when we talk, for example, about deviance, and this sounds like a really kind of one-off activity, and I hope it's okay to say, but we talk about how deviance is constructed, right, as the first step at thinking about how we think about laws are constructed, and then a response to criminal law is constructed, right? We decide what is really right and wrong, and we decide how to respond to behaviors that we deem as being deviant. But what is deviance? And so conceiving of how certain behaviors, used to be deviant at one time and are no longer so. So when I was an infant, right, a long time ago, there were no car seats. My parents just plopped me in the car, right? And so that has a lot to do with technology and our understanding of automobile safety, but it also has a lot to do with how we conceive of, the fragility of infancy and childhood. And so we've changed the way we think about, the way we treat infants is a sort of extreme example, but the marijuana laws, right? And this is, close to a lot of students for whatever reason, but they can understand how, the marijuana use isn't seen as deviant in the same way that their parents saw it as deviant, and certainly that their grandparents saw it as being a deviant behavior. So really looking at how things have changed over time and how they continue to change and how they will and going into the future. And the fact that we can choose to respond to behaviors in certain ways as a society. So that's really a lot of the foundational stuff that I use with students in class. I don't know, Lynn, if you have examples too.
Yeah, I do. So one I'm going to start with, because I think everybody should do it, is Harvard. All you have to put is Harvard implicit bias, and it will come straight up. But I love doing their implicit bias tests and getting the little report after I've done the test telling me about some of the biases I have. So I do that in social psychology, and I encourage students to play around with that website. I saw the nodding from both of you, so you both have been to the website and know it very well. But I will talk about two assignments that I do rather than in-class activities. One assignment is people watching a really, really long documentary, so they have to watch most of the documentary outside of class, but it is about possibly a wrongful conviction. And it's up for debate of whether it's a wrongful conviction, and getting students to write about everything that went wrong with the legal system as they're sort of thinking about whether this is a wrongful conviction and we don't have the answer is just phenomenal. I love reading the papers, and I love the different directions people go in, and they talk about culture, and they talk about race, and they talk about hysteria, communities' hysteria. And so I really like that assignment, to get people to sort of think about problems that go wrong in a legal system. And then another assignment that I actually use in psychology and the law, and I just love this assignment, and it really gets people to think about culture, is I get students to design a juvenile detention center. But the catch is it's in different cities. And so it is fabulous to see how they design a juvenile detention center when it is an urban city that has a lot of diversity versus a rural town that doesn't have a lot of diversity, or New Hampshire that has an older population versus a lot of youth. And that's an opportunity for students to really explore race and age and gender, because they can do it for women, they can do it for men, etc.
That's great. Wow. We're running up against time, so I want to ask this question that came in from one of our attendees. It's a really interesting exercise, Lynn. I have all sorts of things going on in my mind about that. And I was thinking of this when Kate was responding earlier about training too. John asks, are federal or state government involved in helping fund the education of police officers as mature students? And then he put a should/are. So are they involved in funding education of police officers as mature students? And his other question is, should they be? If not, or should they be? So Kate, I don't know if some of our partners, you know, as we've established crime and legal studies, are there public entities that are funding returning students, non-traditional students, working police officers sort of in continuing programs?
There are, and again, it depends on the state, you know, and or municipality. But there are, I don't have a percentage off the top of my head, but I would think it's safe to say most agencies have some type of tuition reimbursement program in place, much as kind of the educational system does, the healthcare system does for current employees who are seeking a higher level of education, and sort of stepping up of the top level of income that is available to someone with, say, a bachelor's degree. So having a higher ceiling of earnings for someone with a degree, as that gets, higher earnings can go up, and so there's an incentivization that way. But I again would argue that there should be an overarching federal policy where this is encouraged, and through the encouragement of it in this very broad way, we are, as a society, capital S, saying that this is important. This is an important part of our society. These are important people in our society. They're doing extraordinarily important work, and they should be given the opportunity and courage to attain as much education as certain, municipalities and agencies see fit, but also to benefit the people that they serve over, and serve with.
Well, and just to add, Kate, because that was such a wonderful answer. Earlier, you had said the law keeps changing. And so that alone is a reason for continued education, is the legal system, thank goodness, is dynamic and changes, which means people should be continuing to be educated.
Right, and certainly to add back, most of that education right now happens in a much more sort of a, training with equipment kind of way. It's more of a hands-on, refreshing and retraining and recurrent training and things like that, rather than, and it's coming more to the fore, training in things like implicit bias and institutional racism. But certainly it is not a sweeping shift in the way that I argue it should be.
Mm-hmm. Well, for the two of you, this probably felt longer than it did for me because I didn't have to speak the entire time, but we're already up against the time. This was wonderful. I feel like this went so quickly, and we could have continued the conversation much further. I really, really appreciate you taking time out of a Saturday to meet with us and lead this discussion. I want to thank the attendees for such great questions. Really a lot of very thought-provoking comments and questions that came in. And I just want to thank the two of you for leading us through it. It was really helpful. We will, for all of you who attended, we will be posting this on our website. We'll send out information next week via social media and email with reminders about where the links are in case you want to share this with anyone. We had a couple of folks who work in law enforcement who attended, so if this is a useful resource for you, we'll make sure you can access it. And I'll also get the information from Lynn on the resources that she talked about earlier, and we'll find some ways to share those as well. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.